Shanti, Shanti. May Brahman protect us. May he guide us and give us strength and right understanding. May love and harmony be with us all. Om, peace, peace, peace. And good evening. We are reading from the complete works of Swami Ramakrishnananda, one of the direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, who started the centers in the southern part of India. We're reading an extensive chapter called Is a Belief in Transmigration Consistent with Reasoning? And he spent the large portion of this, the first couple of sections of this, on the idea of on the idea of how do we know, and then the ideas of how do we reason and how do we know. So we're just now beginning to get into the idea of the transmigration of the soul, and he's actually taken a slightly different tack than what we usually think of when we talk about this, and that's how the, in some sense, through the genetic line, we have existed throughout the entire history of the genetic line, because the DNA material and the mitochondrial DNA in the cells have gotten passed on and passed on and passed on and passed on. So there's that endless, seemingly endless chain of continuity. And so he's gone into that. Now, we're going to start where we should start. Children are born. Yes, that's a good place to start. Okay.
Children are born with a natural fear of death. This fear cannot be in them unless they previously experienced the pangs of death. That proves the existence of their previous lives. But as we have seen that their previous lives were the same as those of their parents, it is natural for them to fear death because they've been experiencing the pangs of death without beginning. It is a fact that the child inherits most of the characteristics of its parents, but in some cases, this does not hold true. We have seen that sometimes the children of pariahs become so great that they claim worship even from the best of brahmanas. So is the case with many of the Alwars and the Nayanmars of southern India, and devotees of northern India such as Haridasa, the Yavana, and others. The child in this case has not inherited the characteristics of his ancestors. We shall know of the Puranika narrative of Prahlada, the infant devotee. He was descendant of a line of kings who had been holding Vishnu in utter abhorrence. But exactly opposite was the character of Prahlada, who is regarded as one of the best of the Vaishnavas. The theory of heredity, which we have considered previously, does not hold here, inasmuch as according to that theory, a horse can never produce a man, nor man can ever produce a horse. A brahmana can never produce a pariah, nor a pariah can never produce a brahmana. When a theory is not sufficient to account for facts, it must be regarded as insufficient and imperfect, however sufficient and perfect it may appear. We must prefer another which can explain those facts.
A very interesting way of looking at things. Yes, we know that offspring don't always resemble the parents in their characteristics, that we sometimes inherit some of the characteristics of our parents, but sometimes there are other things that we do not inherit. So there are many incidences in history where, for example, someone is born very musical, and sometimes they've been born into a very musical family. And other times they're born into a family that's not interested in music, and they have a hard time pursuing their chosen field. Or perhaps it's an art or some other field. Or perhaps it's a genius in some sort of scientific field or something. It doesn't necessarily depend on the qualities of the parents. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So I usually think of it as more of a combination of things. We come in with some scars from our previous births, and we are then allowed to have some parameters as to what kind of karma we're going to work out in this particular life and the kind of parents we're going to have. And so we have to sometimes choose parents that create certain difficulties that we have come to overcome. We have to overcome the difficulties. So we choose parents so that we have to do that. Or we choose circumstances where there'll be things that will cause us to force us to overcome certain difficulties in order to live out certain karmic patterns that we need to fulfill. So it's a very complicated matter. And of course, what kind of genes are expressed and what kinds of genes are not expressed also has to do with the kind of upbringing that we have. Sometimes there are incidences where people go along without any particular interest in a particular field because they've never been exposed to it. And then suddenly they see, of course in modern days it would be perhaps a TV program or a movie or a newscast or something. In the olden days it might be they were exposed to a book or some visitor from another town coming in, and they suddenly get exposed to the idea of a different profession or a different line of work or a different line of inquiry and become very fascinated by it. And so then that interest then becomes awakened in them at a later age. And so all these things happen, and it's very difficult to really explain all of the ins and outs of how that happens. And so we will, and of course we can have mutations too. Just because the parents have certain sets of genes doesn't mean those are that our genes are going to match them exactly. There might be mutations along the way. So that's another thing to consider. So let's see with what Swami Ramakrishnananda is going to say. And we have to remember that he's speaking over 100 years ago here, so he may not be totally up to date on things.
One can never deny that one's body has been inherited from one's ancestors, whose origin is from time without beginning. But the dweller in the body may not necessarily come from the author of the authors of the body, as has just now been shown. Hence, we cannot but admit two parallel lines of existence, material and spiritual. Man is a mixture of matter and spirit. Spirit is the subject or the seer. Matter is the object or the seen. Hence, they are diametrically opposite in their character. Whatever is material in us, we inherit from our fathers, and whatever is spiritual in us is our own. We do not inherit that from anyone, that being our very essence. We are merely dwellers in our bodies, which are as so many tools in our hands with which we shape our destinies. It is a fact that every man is reaping the fruits of his own actions, and according to the merits and demerits of his action, he will have a good or bad body or dwelling house to live in. If a pariah lives an exceptionally good life, he cannot be born as a pariah again. It is natural for us to conclude that he must be promoted to the holy body of a true Brahmana. One who draws 5 rupees a month will have to live in a dingy den. But when the same man, by means of a certain meritorious act, is suddenly promoted to the post of 100 rupees a month, it is natural for him to change his den for an airy and neat dwelling house surrounded by a nice-looking garden. Similarly, if a Brahmana leads an exceptionally immoral life, he will have to come down and take his birth in the house of a filthy pariah. Nay, sometimes he may go down lower still and find his place only amongst the lower animals. People committing heinous offenses are sent to jail to be punished there, and those doing works of great merit are rewarded sumptuously in the shape of titles and preferments. Similarly, when a man does all sorts of evil actions and with impunity tyrannizes over his fellow brethren, it is most right that he should be sent to God's house of correction, popularly known as hell, to expiate the evil effects of his past misdeeds. And when the unrewarded merit of a good man passes away unnoticed from the earth, the divine reward is what we all wish him to have from the hand of the Most High, which we know is heaven.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting, too, if you look at the lives of the various saints and sages with which we might be more familiar. For example, if you've read Swami Ramakrishnananda's book, Sri Sarada Devi and Her Divine Play, it has several chapters on her relatives, and they were not an easy bunch. Here you have an example of people with the same genetic background. Of course, the in-laws had different backgrounds, but her brothers and sisters and so forth had the same genetic background, and they certainly weren't all saintly like Sri Sarada Devi. So you can't expect everyone to be the same just because they came from the same parents. And that just has to do with the fact that we all are coming in with different samskaras, and there are innumerable numbers of ways the genes can resort themselves between two parents. If you know how to do permutations and commutations back in Algebra 2, if you try to do that with 46 chromosomes, you realize how many tremendous number of possibilities there are. And then you include the possibility of mutations and crossovers and all sorts of genetic things like that, and the possibilities are truly endless. So our conditions aren't necessarily going to be terribly obvious sometimes from even the genetic standpoint. You can't really explain everything very clearly because there are just too many possibilities. In fact, it's possible for a brother and sister not to have any of the same genes. Not very likely, but it's possible that the genes sorted out so that you got all of one parent and all of one of another parent, and all the ones you didn't get, the sibling got. And so you would be very different. So genetics is a tricky thing. There's some tendencies, but there are also some extreme possibilities as well. All right, let's continue to see what he says here.
The living organism is the fit receptacle for a soul to live in. This we inherit from our parents as a reward or punishment for our moderately good or bad past actions, inasmuch as the body is healthy and pure, or filthy and diseased. Heaven or hell we may get here inasmuch as we are wealthy, happy, and good or impoverished, wretched and wicked. But there are actions of so great a merit that we cannot imagine anything here as can prove a proper reward for them. And so the existence of another locality called heaven is therefore natural for us to admit. Similarly, there are offenses so very heinous and horrible, there can be no proper punishment for them here. And therefore, it is also natural for us to admit the existence of a separate locality known as hell. If a man lives the life of a beast, the body of a beast should be his proper inheritance. This is also the opinion of our sages, and I can quote several mantras from the Upanishads and several verses from the Gita the Puranas and the Yathasas to uphold this view, which is perfectly rational. But I desist from doing so, referring my indulgent audience to those passages which are to be found everywhere, all through our scriptures.
Yeah, so again, it's these ideas of other realms where we experience various rewards and punishments is fairly common in a lot of different traditions. It's not unique to Hinduism at all. You find it in the Abrahamic religions as well. The only difference is that's a one-shot affair, and in Hinduism it's a temporary affair, and you might have a temporary experience in one of these other realms, and then you come back to reap more effects of karma and produce more karmas, and so forth. So, and of course we also have to remember that people are born to play different roles in this divine drama. And so it's often said that, Radhu was there to give Sri Sarada Devi some worldly attachment to keep her body here, otherwise she wouldn't have been able to stay on earth and do her role. So people are given certain roles in the divine drama in order for things to play out the way they're supposed to play out. You even find that in the ideas in the Puranas about Ravana. Ravana apparently chose to lead this evil part of the drama because they promised him quicker enlightenment that way than if he lived a more placid life. So in order to be rewarded for having to play this horrible role, he got quicker illumination. That's an interesting concept, but I don't recommend that anyway. That's the way some of the Puranic literature puts it. Okay.
Some objections are raised against this view, which is our duty to meet and refute. The first objection is that if you hold our souls to be immortal and having living bodies to dwell in previous to this life, why do we not remember them? In reply, we ask the objector if he can narrate all the incidents connected with his babyhood in this life. If he tries, he will not be able to remember all the incidents of even yesterday through which he has passed. When he cannot do so, it is not possible for him to remember the incidents connected with his past life. We have heard about and even may have people who have altogether forgotten most of the things of their early life after their recovery from the shock of a virulent disease. To remember a thing, we should always compose and concentrate our mind. But are we allowed to do so? As soon as the child comes out of the womb, our atmosphere proves very much inclement to it, and it cries out in pain, feeling a kind of pinching sensation all over its mollusk-like, soft, and tiny organism. Hunger and thirst attack him, and necessarily the mind becomes so much distracted and disturbed that it is but natural for it to forget all about its past life. The Son of Man, ever since his birth, is engaged in fighting against his environments, and he has no leisure left for him to consider about matters other than what is strictly connected with the incessant craving of this life. Is it not natural for him, therefore, to forget all about his past? The terrible shock which the embryo experiences when it is pushed out of the womb to be thrown into the outer world is alone sufficient to make it forget everything connected with its past existences. We've heard of people who could remember all the incidents of their past lives, such as Lord Buddha. They are called Jatismaras, or knowers of their past lives. This is only possible when a yogi, having still some desires left in him, takes his birth here. As his mind has full mastery over his organism, neither the shock at the time of his birth, neither hunger, thirst, nor cold can have any influence over him, and he can easily remember all about his past lives. Bhagavan Patanjali says, that is, when a man is fully and perfectly independent, wanting no help from any being here in this universe, he may know all about his past lives. This is only possible for a man who is a perfect master of his environments, as well as his organism and mind. Nature cannot frighten him at the time. He is beyond her reach altogether. And thus left to himself, he has and can easily bring all the incidents of his past lives before his mind.
Well, there was something I meant to mention earlier, so this is backtracking a little bit, but one philosopher was talking about the effects of upbringing on children. And he brought up the interesting scenario. Suppose that someone has to use another woman in order to achieve a pregnancy. So they take the ovum out of the woman who is not able to conceive and put it into another woman. So you have a surrogate mother. So she's going to be the surrogate mother. So you've got the egg from one mother, but it's raised in the womb of a second mother. Then when it's born, it has a midwife who does the suckling, who allows it, nourishes the baby from her breast. So then you've got a third mother. All of those mothers have an influence on the baby, and not directly genetically, but hormonally based influences affect the baby. Whether being in the womb of another woman affects the fetus, and being nurtured by another woman affects the fetus, because those influences are different. They have different energies. The energy of the milk coming from another woman is going to be different. The hormonal balances is going to be different. The food she eats might be different. So all of those things are factors to be considered. So you can see how complicated it gets, where people can have influences from multiple mothers at the same time. Then we've talked a little bit earlier, too, about the children who spontaneously remember their past lives. And there are many, many incidences of that. Several books have been written on it, with hundreds and hundreds of cases being documented. And now they have them on TV. We have many interesting cases that are documented. And in some incidences, they are able to trace the life of the person to someone who actually lived. They can remember enough details about their past life that they can find out the information. Especially these days with the internet, you can look up certain things about that the person's remembering and piece it together and finally find out who that person was. And they found some very convincing matches. Now, in addition to that, of course, in the last several decades, it's become very popular to have regressions, where psychologists will regress you, hypnotists will regress you into not only earlier childhood traumas, but they'll regress you into past lives and in the in-between state between lives. Those are a little less convincing than the ones that are spontaneously remembered, because you don't really know how deeply under that person is and how much their fantasies are delving into this realm, and how much is genuine. So some of it's probably genuine, some of it's probably not, and it's difficult to sort that out. But it is very interesting that in those cases, you actually do end up with a few cases where people remember past lives on other realms other than the Earth, in other words, other planet systems and so forth, which, if you want to push this back forever, would logically have to be the case, because before the planet Earth was around, where would these souls have been developing karma and so forth? But that gets very complicated, and there's no way to prove any of it. Some people remember lives in Atlantis. Now, is that just a romantic again, since this is coming from regression therapy, is this just some romantic notion of theirs, or is it something genuine? Difficult to understand. All right, let's continue here.
The next objection is that it is impossible for a human being to be born as a horse in his next incarnation. It is a patent fact that man can only bring forth men and not horses. We've already answered that objection by affirming that the human soul gets its body according to its action and tendencies. But to this, the objector says, why then does the man born as horse lose all his human nature and get all the nature of a horse instead? In reply, we say that a being inherits its nature from its parents, and moreover, the shock at the time of its birth makes it forget that it has been a human being before, as has already been explained. Now, the objector may say, if it is a fact that the human soul is ever progressing, as a boy is wiser than a baby, a young man is wiser than a boy, a full-grown man is wiser than a young man, then how can it be possible for a soul, after its reasoning power has been matured in manhood, to be born as a baby again in its next incarnation? Our reply is that it is not a fact that a man ever continues to be wiser with the increase of his age. Extreme old age is as good as childhood. Many may have seen that.
Well, and of course, again, you're starting out in a new body, and so your new body and your new mind have to develop according to its own nature. But we have seen many examples of people with extraordinary talents or extraordinary propensities to learn particular things, how they learn certain things much more quickly than an ordinary person would learn, which would indicate that perhaps their previous incarnation had mastered that particular talent or subject matter. So these things get very complicated, of course. And then, of course, there's this idea that, well, if you haven't lived a very good human life, then you end up getting reborn as an animal. There are some indications of that in the scriptures. And so then that sort of gives a whole other twist to this. And then, of course, Hollywood gives it a whole other twist. There was even one sitcom that had the mother being reincarnated as a car. So anyway, we won't try to justify Hollywood's interpretation of these things. And then, of course, there was the talking horse, Mr. Ed. So you get all these strange things in Hollywood, but we're not going to try to justify those. All right, let's see what our next paragraph brings.
Men are born with certain tendencies. No two men have the same tendency. And if tendencies are the results of repeatedly doing certain series of actions, we can only account for the tendencies in babies by admitting a past state of existence, wherein they have acquired these tendencies. If you ask an old man when he is healthy and jolly if he really thinks himself old at the time, he's sure to answer you in the negative. And why? Because a really healthy man is he who never thinks that he has a body. Consciousness of body does not come unless a man feels some pain somewhere in it, such as a headache, an ulcer, with stinking matter in it, and so forth. And the healthy and jolly old man, having thus no consciousness of his old body, can never think of himself to be old at the time. This proves that the dweller in the body has no connection with the body.
Yeah, so it's interesting if you look at identical twins or even Siamese twins, where they have two heads, but not necessarily two complete bodies, and so they're joined somewhere. And so they've got two different beings existing in the same, to some extent, the same body, but they don't necessarily have the same ideas. Identical twins don't necessarily have all the same interests. They may have very similar interests, but they're not identical because that's the difference between the genetic influence and the soul influence. The souls that have been inhabiting the two different identical twins had different backgrounds. And so they've worked those out in this previous lifetime. It'd be an interesting study to try to figure out how that works with conjoined twins, as to what difficulties they have in reconciling the differences with their partner that they can't get away from. I'm not sure I've seen a study like that, a psychological study on conjoined twins. Okay.
We've already seen that a man is a mixture of subject and object, the knower and the known. If we try to study the real character of the subject, we at once come to know its immortal nature. Subject or soul being the knower, all knowledge is gathered in it. It is the receptacle of all knowledge. The soul has the power of choosing either to entertain or drive away all ideas and still live. That proves that it is independent of the mind, which deals only in ideas. Mind is constantly changing with the change of the ideas. But the soul, being beyond the mind, is not changing when the latter is changing. The soul is the one changeless background upon which all the innumerable and ever-shifting mental phenomena rest, as space is the one changeless background of all the innumerable physical phenomena. Now, whatever is changeless must be permanent or immortal, for death means a sudden change in a certain course of existence. Hence, the soul must be immortal and independent. Now we can clearly understand that the human being existed even before his birth and is going to exist even after his death. The fear of death and many other tendencies in a baby prove that it had a previous incarnation wherein it has to do those actions which resulted in those tendencies and had to experience the pangs of death, the faint impression of which gives it that instinctive fear of death. Even the young ones of lower animals, such as monkeys, rhinoceroses, so forth, evince wonderful instinctive knowledge, which can only be accounted for by admitting a previous state of existence. For instance, the baby monkey, before it fully comes out of the womb, puts forth its hands first and firmly catches hold of the bough of a tree, while the mother jumps to a branch in the opposite direction, leaving the newborn baby dangling down the bough. The baby rhinoceros runs away from his mother as soon as it is born to protect itself from being torn away by the sharp tongue of its mother, who also at that time becomes blind providentially, cannot run after her baby. After 5 or 7 days, the mother and the baby meet when the latter has got its skin tough enough to bear the caresses of its dam. The explanation of these instincts lies only in the admittance of the existence of similarly previous lives.
And of course, that information is in the genes. And you could say that we're all descendant from a gene pool that has survived long enough to have offspring. Nobody is the product of genes that didn't have offspring. So, and so if your genetic material has managed to survive long enough to have offsprings for as long back as you can bring the trace of genetic line, then you have to realize that you're programmed to survive. You're programmed to try to survive. It's built into you. Otherwise, you didn't survive, and those genes didn't get passed on. The genes that get passed on are the ones that are programmed to survive successfully. So that's why we have this fear of death, and why this instinct on how to survive is built in to us at a very young age. And of course, they've done some experiments as to when certain fears in children come about. when does a baby learn that it can't just crawl off the edge of a table and that sort of thing. And they rig things up where it looks like there's an edge to a table, but there really isn't an edge to the table. It's a glass, and they make it look like there's an edge. And up until a certain age, the baby just walks right over it, not recognizing any fear of that at all. They just the brain hasn't developed enough yet. And then at a certain age, they begin to realize that they can't crawl off the edge of something. So all these kinds of experiments are rather interesting to see how long it takes the infant to learn various fears. So this is an interesting one that he brings up about the rhinoceros. I don't think I've ever run across that one before. Of course, you don't run into too many rhinoceroses over here, so don't have too much experience with them. So interesting lines of reasoning here. But again, we have to remember he doesn't have the benefit of all the experiments and knowledge that we've gained in the last 100 years plus. But his information still is very interesting. And yes, the soul is that permanent thing. It's interesting when you read or listen to these accounts of people that have had near-death experiences, how the two things that are fairly common is a surprise that they're conscious. They realize, oh, I'm dead, but I'm still conscious. And that consciousness survives the bodily death. And the second thing is after they come back, they don't fear death anymore. We had one devotee that lived across the street when I first joined, had a near-death experience from a choking experience. She was choked on some food and was out of her body for a short period, and somebody then brought her back. But she said, after having that experience, she never feared death because it was a perfectly pleasant experience. And you realize that your consciousness survives death. Those are really the two kind of uniform things. Also, probably the third most common thing is this feeling of great love and acceptance. And there's, whereas you get from the Judeo-Christian tradition more of an idea of judgment and that type of thing. But most of these near-death experience things talk about just a beautiful, embracing, loving presence in this near-death experience. And you usually get that too from the people that have remembering their past life. If they remember anything at all in between, it's usually quite pleasant, and they usually have a sense that they've been sent down for a particular purpose. They've been either they chose the parents or their parents were chosen for them for a particular reason. A couple of them were very interesting in how they chose the parents. Of course, that shocked the parents when they heard that. The little kid who says, "Oh, well, I chose you." "You did? How did you do that?" Well, and so then they go on to describe how they chose that particular parent. So apparently there is some freedom in the parents we choose. And that, again, goes along with working out our various karmic problems that we have, being able to work out the kinds of lessons we need to learn and the kinds of desires we need to fulfill, and we choose our parents accordingly. And that you might say, well, gee, I don't know why I chose my parents. Well, probably you had lessons you had to learn. And in the in-between state, you see things in a much more overall, universal type of viewpoint, and it doesn't trouble you that you have lessons to learn, and it doesn't trouble you that you're going to be taking on difficulties. So this is an interesting way to get a better perspective on our situation, and we learn not to be as judgmental about ourselves and about other people when you realize that this is all kind of part of an interwoven huge drama where it's hard to keep track of all the characters and how they all interrelate. Sort of like the Mahabharata. If you've ever read the Mahabharata, it is the most dauntingly complicated Puranic text where it's very difficult to keep track of all the characters and the stories within stories within stories. You're in one story, and then they're going to tell another story about another time, which then relates another story. And pretty soon you're completely lost. At least I am. I have a lot of trouble with some of that. All right, we have a few minutes. Let's read another paragraph and see what we got here.
All these considerations corroborate the instruction of our sages, and the more we shall be able to use our reasoning faculty rightly, the more we shall be able to understand those gods on earth. Science and philosophy, instead of being antagonistic to theology, are great helps to many to understand the latter. Fortunate are they indeed who have an innate love, regard, and veneration for those glorious beings of past prehistoric times, whose abodes were in the solitary forests and mountain caves of ancient India. That afforded them ample shelter and help for those higher thoughts and carried them beyond the boundary line of space, time, and causation. May we all have our highest regards for them. If we'd all try to improve ourselves in any way here.
All right, well, that is the end of that section. We probably don't have time to start another one, but we can just sort of summarize and amplify what he's been talking about. And as we mentioned before, he didn't have the benefit of several books written on past life experiences of people and all these documentations of near-death experiences and so forth, and past life regressions. But of course, past life regression is really a kind of a different way of going about what a yogi would do on their own. And if you've got the yogic powers to concentrate your mind and purify your mind, then you can, on your own, experience what your past lives were. And people like Swami Vivekananda knew all his past lives and could read other people's past lives, like a book. Just looking at them, he could tell what their past lives were like. So, and then of course, with our genetic research, we have a lot more information about the genes. Somebody last time was mentioning that they weren't familiar with the idea of mitochondrial DNA. In your cells, you have your chromosomes, which are inherited from both parents. But you also have cellular material, which is only inherited by the mother, and that's the mitochondrial DNA. The mitochondria are the things inside your cells which are your energy generating factories. They're the little organisms in there that allow the cell to convert food into energy and allow the cell to survive. John Dobson used to say that you're basically a hotel of billions of rooms for the mitochondria to live in. And so, because it's only inherited from the mother, you see the father only, the sperm only has the genetic material in it, but the egg is a whole cell, and so the mitochondria is in the egg, it's not in the sperm. And so your mitochondrial DNA is only inherited from the mother, and so they can trace back people's ancestry through the mother's line through the mitochondrial DNA. They can trace your ancestry in your male line through the Y chromosome, which is only inherited from the father. So we have these two genetic tricks that allow us to trace both male and female ancestry back through generations and generations of time. And so when this was first discovered, they dubbed the first woman Mitochondrial Eve, the first woman that whose mitochondria has survived all these generations. Then, of course, with the idea of evolution, you've got various organisms evolving from one organism to another. And Darwin was able to document some cases of rather rapid evolution when he studied the things in the Galapagos Islands. In the lab, when we study fruit flies, and we can generate a whole generation of fruit flies in a matter of a few weeks, and so you can study them, their genetic inheritance over a long period of time, and find mutants that are conducive to better fruit flies and not conducive to better fruit flies, and so forth. So you can study genetics in the lab in ways that you certainly couldn't have done way back in Swami Ramakrishnananda's era. So we certainly do have a lot of information that organisms can evolve from one into the other according to necessities and environmental impact. You can do the same thing with bacteria, and you put bacteria in a particular environment, and then you kind of tweak the environment to stress it in a certain way, and you find out that a lot of the bacteria dies off, but there are a few survivors that have just the right genes to survive, and then they multiply, and then they can survive in this new environment. And then if you change the environment back again, it shifts, and a lot of those die off because they're no longer suited to the old environment. But a few are still able to survive, and then their gene pool shifts again. So we know that evolution does happen, but the fact that evolution seems to have punctuated with rapid periods of evolution is difficult to explain on a purely mechanical basis. But of course, if you take the idea that consciousness is at the ground of all being, and consciousness is driving evolution, then you can see that things can go at whatever speed they need to go. Consciousness will find the right mechanism to manifest itself in the right way to survive. It seems that life has a magical way of surviving all sorts of extreme environments. We've found evidences of life in sheets of ice that have been existing for thousands of years, and we find them in hot plumes at the bottom of the ocean where the pressure would crush any kind of normal organism. So all these extreme organisms have managed to evolve over time into organisms which can survive in their extreme environments. So because consciousness is at the root of all being, consciousness drives its ability to survive and its ability to adapt into new environments. All right, so next time we will start the chapter on how to be a real master. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with Brahman are the things we see. Filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. From Brahman all, yet is it still the same. Om, peace, peace, peace.